There are plenty of powerful moves out there, but there are some that are so strong that it can sometimes baffle us that they continue to be allowed. So we're diving into the 10 most broken moves ever that have not been unilaterally banned across both VGC and singles. And let's jump right in, starting with the iconic Thunder Wave. If you can simply spam a move and ruin pretty much whatever you're facing, well, that's generally a warning sign of, if not being broken, then at least being broken adjacent. Enter with Thunder Wave, which has been slowing Pokemon down and, more importantly, making them unable to move a stunning 25% of the time since the first generation. In the first couple gens, Paralysis was often used as a power boost, since when the opponent can't move and thus can't heal or threaten you in return, you basically get to hit them for free. Power creep rolling in meant players looked to actual direct power itself to break the opposition, but eventually they realized that Paralysis wasn't any less effective in this regard. If anything, it was more effective, since you needed less full Paralysis since your Pokemon was hitting the opponent harder than in the first few generations. Just one full Paralysis was often game-breaking. In a similar vein, players had begun using Thunder Wave as a last-ditch desperation bailout, and it worked a lot for something that was basically a concession to a loss if it didn't work out. In both singles and VGC, Prankster Thundurus was being used to check, well, everything. And from that point on, it was clear, Thunder Wave counters everything. Entire team styles were built around Paralysis being so ruinous and so favorable to the player using it that it almost felt free. Choice Scarfers began running Thunder Wave. Who cares about being locked into it when the effect is this impactful? Whatever you're facing, Thunder Wave probably ruins it somehow. And it's not even about the speed drop, as even Pokemon slower than everything to begin with are regularly ruined by just one key full Paralysis, to say nothing of the Pokemon that go fishing for multiple Paralysis and often getting them through spamming Substitute. And speaking of losing control of the game, our next move on the list is Follow Me and Rage Powder. But before we move on to the redirection moves, here's a word from our sponsor, the GOAT, Surfshark VPN. A VPN, or a virtual private network, is a server that you can connect to that encrypts not only your private data, but also your location. You can even use this to pretend like you're in another country. Now, why would this come in handy? Well, with streaming services like Netflix, you're often region locked. For example, if I were to vacation in Japan, where there are no subtitles on my anime, I could use Surfshark and change my VPN back to the US or vice versa, and now I have American Netflix wherever I go. You can do this with multiple countries because Surfshark has 3,200 plus servers in over 100 countries. You supercharge any streaming service you have by doing this. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark keeps your outgoing data encrypted and safe. For example, I travel a decent amount, which means I'm often at the airport and need to use the Wi-Fi to keep track of my spending, because sometimes I go overboard on overpriced meals. But people on the public Wi-Fi at the airport could be lurking to access some of my sensitive data. But thanks to Surfshark, I just boot it up and my data is safe and secure. And one of the best features that separates Surfshark from the other VPNs is that you can use it on unlimited devices. That's right, no additional subscriptions required. You can put it on all of your devices. And there's no risk thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below and go to surfshark.com/fallswipe or use code FALLSWIPE at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Redirection is a core strategy in VGC, and it's so common that sometimes you forget just how ridiculously powerful it is. One way to look at it is that it allows you to circumvent the 2v2 nature of doubles. Generally, it's easier to deal with a massively powerful threat because you can have 2 Pokemon that can target it. It almost doesn't matter how strong the threat is. Even something like Geomancy Xerneas becomes more manageable when you can double target it. It may not be easy to deal with, but it is easier. With Follow Me and Rage Powder though, that option is essentially taken away from you. It almost inherently disrupts the basic tenets of the format. It enables all sorts of Pokemon, and the ones that are already good get launched into the stratosphere. That also helps that the redirection users tend to be on the seriously bulky side, most famously Amoonguss, and since these moves can be used repeatedly, unlike the other VGC staple, Protect, if you can't quickly KO that redirector, as is very plausible, you might be left unable to touch that terrifying Pokemon mowing your team down at all. Spread moves? Sure, but they don't hit quite as hard since their base power is lowered for how they're hitting both targets. Another way to look at it is to look at some of the Pokemon that have used Follow Me over the years. What beyond the crazy, at least broken adjacent move would enable such lunacy as Eviolite, Magmar, and Electabuzz to be used at the highest level of play? Since VGC plays so quickly, even one turn of guaranteeing that a move won't hit your ally Pokemon can be game breaking. It's so simple, a level 1 Smeargle could do it, and get results. And speaking of results, yours might very well be affected by the odds of Rock Slide. Rock Slide is famously one of the most hated attacks in VGC. The damage and rock coverage is great and everything, and it's good to have a spread move that targets so many of the rock weak staples across the generations, but that's not why it's hated. It's hated because as far as moves that can bail you out of a desperate situation are concerned, it's one of the most reliable, as it's packing a 30% flinch rate. Actually it's 27% accounting for accuracy. So here comes Rock Slide with its 27% flinch rate, ready to save you at the 11th hour or break a close game wide open, which it also tends to do to infuriating effect even when it's not actively being fished for. It'll be anyone's game and someone goes for a Rock Slide just to deal damage and bam, something key flinches, making the game much easier for the Rock Slide user. Yeah, those are some pretty messed up odds. You know how much full para stings with its 25%? And this is even higher, but then you realize that Rock Slide isn't just threatening one flinch proc. Both opposing Pokemon are at risk of getting flinched. The odds of Rock Slide flinching at least one of two targets, accounting for accuracy, is a whopping 46.71%. But don't worry, Pokemon rounds down, so it's just 46%. Said nobody ever in the face of Rock Slide, infuriatingly consistent as a crutch get out of jail free card, and a plethora of other less polite expressions. Let's not even get into the pandemonium that occurs when Rock Slide flinches both opposing Pokemon. It's not likely, but happens more than you'd expect. And when it does, well, VGC players seem to have invented Rage Fist generations before Annihilate. Jokes aside, as far as singles go, once Stone Edge was introduced in Gen 4, it eclipsed Rock Slide in almost all but a few specific cases. But in Gen 3, Rock Slide was absolutely despised for doing, well, exactly what it did in VGC. In a world without Choice Scarf and next to no priority, many a late game scenario was ruined by Dragon Dance Tyranitar and or Choice Band Aerodactyl attacking with their stab and being rewarded with a flinch for it. It's one reason why sturdy rock resists are so important in advance, because when you try to use a non-rock resist to answer these meta-defining threats, you're often just a flinch away from losing. Even something as bulky as Skarmory or Suicune is susceptible. It's been quite the source of controversy in the past, and there's a saying among Gen 3 players, when there's an arrow, there's a way. Well, at least Rock Slide wasn't automatically KOing everything in sight, right? That'd be crazy. Game Freaks surely wouldn't, except they definitely did in Gen 9, as Last Respects and Rage Fist are next on our list. Gen 9 didn't just unleash a horde of insanely overpowered Pokemon, but raised the ante with moves as well, and these two were their masterpieces, both Ghost types fittingly, going along with the recent generation trend of Ghost becoming the preeminent offensive type in the wake of no longer being resisted by Steel and Pursuit being removed from the game. But even previous standards in this regard like Caloric Shadow had to bow in awe of how automatically these moves deleted their opponents. Last Respects is basically the move equivalent to King Gambit's Supreme Overlord ability, where it gets a power boost for each teammate that's fainted. It's both a cool concept and a bit of a worrying one, since it punishes the most essential part of the game, KOing your opponent's Pokemon. But as long as the boosts aren't especially egregious, it's fine. Of course, this being Game Freak, the boosts were outrageously excessive. With no fainted teammates, Last Respect sits at a measly 50 base power, but it goes up by 50 base power for each fainted teammate. You've suddenly got Earthquake level power, so that's cool. Then another teammate faints, and as a reward for this standard fare, suddenly you've got a staggering 150 base power Juggernaut. Even with Houndstone's rather pedestrian base 101 attack, it's coming dangerously close to those auto KOs with a Choice Band attached and a lack of resist, which is especially scary on a Sand Rush Pokemon that outspeeds just about everything. And then the third teammate goes down, and you're really off to the races. The fourth and especially fifth are almost overkill, except they also serve to make mincemeat of resist. Arceus Forbid at Terra Ghost. So yes, it was insanely easy to just let everything faint and then outspeed and auto drop everything with Last Respects. And speaking of lose-lose situations, how do you get those KOs you need to win the game? By damaging the opponent, of course. You better not do that against Annihilate though, because every time you do, you strengthen its Rage Fist, which boosts just like Last Respects. Each hit boosts its initial 50 base power by a further 50. Oh, it doesn't reset if Annihilate switches either, so it can switch in to absorb a weak U-turn early on, and bam, Rage Fist is already boosted. The move doesn't even have to do damage. Annihilate can switch into a close combat that does 0%, and it still counts. As you might imagine, this gets out of hand ridiculously quickly, and especially defensive bulk up rests Annihilate, especially if its shifted weaknesses through Terra, quickly attained an auto KO Rage Fist against everything, because not only was it weathering hits as it boosted, but its boost was of course strengthening its attack stat as well. Plus, while Last Respects was solely a singles affair, Annihilate works in VGC as well. It is immune to Fake Out after all, and everyone's favorite ghost resist, Incineroar, runs in Terra from its fighting stat, leaving most everything else in Terra of its Rage Fist. And we're not done with such pummeling moves either. These next ones are frighteningly crafty with Surging Strikes and Wicked Blow. Urshifu Rapid Strike seems just about perfectly designed to, well, strike at the very core of BGC strategies. Good speed, good natural physical bulk, killer attack, superb dual stab. Yes, that's all well and good, but here's where it becomes great. Number 1, its ability Unseen Fist, which ignores Protect. This is huge, of course, but Urshifu's Single Strike has that ability as well. So why Rapid Strike? Well, its signature move, Surging Strikes, is surgical in its disassembling of two major cornerstones of VGC, Intimidate and Focus Sash. It helps that Rapid Strike so thoroughly terrorizes Intimidate Pokemon, but that's never stopped Incineroar and Landorus before. They're renowned for intimidating even those Pokemon that threaten them. In the face of Surging Strikes though, they are helpless, because the move always crits each of its 3 hits. This means you can't even lead off with Intimidate to slow Urshifu down before switching to something else to take it on. Additionally, those 3 hits mean it ruins Focus Sashers, slicing right through the item. And again, you can't potentially help your Sasher out with Intimidate, nor can the Sasher even guard itself with Protect thanks to Unseen Fist. This lets Rapid Strike absolutely throttle VGC. All it needs is a bit of help with its speed, and well, that's just some Tailwind support or a Choice Scarf away from being solved. It helps when it's being paired with Chin Pao to lower opponents' defenses further, but it's all in the service of the perfect pulverizing precision of Surging Strikes. Meanwhile, over in singles, Urshifu's Single Strike signature Wicked Blow brandished its own form of brokenness that's made it too good for OU in both Gens 8 and 9. Wicked Blow also always results in a critical hit, laughing in the face of would-be answer Landorus Intimidate, and for a physical attacker to be so unafraid of Lando T was superb. Even if it managed to pivot into Intimidate a close combat, the follow-up Wicked Blow would remain as strong as ever thanks to the built-in crit. Now, it wasn't the auto crit alone that made Wicked Blow broken, as there are several other moves with the mechanic. Meowscarada's Flower Trick, for example, is very good but not broken. However, Wicked Blow distinguishes itself through its design, not just that it's coming off of Urshifu's massive attack stat and is bolstered further by Unseen Fist. First, it's stronger than the other auto crit moves. Flower Trick is 70 base power, which brings it up to 105 after the crit. Frost Breath and Storm Throw are 60 base power, coming up to 90. Even Urshifu Rapid Strike, an amazing Pokemon in singles as well, didn't quite hit as hard with Surging Strikes effectively. Its 3 hits collectively coming in at 112 base power. Wicked Blow at 80 base power was boosted to 120 after a crit. It was effectively a Dark type close combat, and that was the other part of what made it such a terror. Dark, like Ghost, has been one of the most spammable types in the game since it ceased to be resisted by Steel in Gen 6. A perfect storm. Without Wicked Blow, it is uncertain Urshifu's Single Strike, amazing as it is otherwise, to be so overwhelming in singles. Now, all this damage was great, but sometimes the most busted move could be one whose damage output was irrelevant. I'm of course talking about Knockoff. As the correct move for its ability to make meaningful progress no matter what switches in, Knockoff is nearly peerless. It was buffed in Gen 6, receiving a major base power buff. Previously, it was 20 base power, and now it was 65, unless it hit a Pokemon with an item, in which case it would get a 50% power boost. As far as physical Dark type power went, well, this left Crunch in the dust, and was easily superb now that Steel no longer resisted Dark. Knockoff is only at its scariest on the first hit, because you can only rid something of its item once, and once you've done that, you're not hitting it as hard. But that first hit is devastating, because ridding something of its item is huge. No Pokemon likes losing its item, but when you switch into Knockoff, you have no choice. Gen 6 somewhat quelled this with Mega Stones, and Gen Z's addition of Z Crystals helped further, but these were generally quite specific, and both vanished in Gen 8, making Knockoff really unstoppable. Sticky Hold gimmicks notwithstanding, which was especially key given how many Pokemon were relying on heavy-duty boots so as to not get ransacked by hazards. Knockoff's offensive power is massive on threats like Bisharp and Weavile, yes, and a big part of how threatening they are is that in addition to their strong hits, they're also ridding you of your item. But even when the hit itself doesn't land for particularly notable damage, the fact that whatever switches in will, for instance, no longer heal with leftovers is massively abusable. It's why a post-Toxic Orb activation Gliscor is so often used as a knockoff switch, and it is a good one against many targets, but it's far from perfect. Have fun with Gliscor switching into Weavile, for instance. Funnily enough, Gens 3 to 5, which had 20 base power knockoff, took note of just how devastating the item removal was, and they began spamming it as well, to tremendous results. The move does no damage whatsoever, but completely reshaped Gen 5's long-withstanding Ferrothorn dynamic, and was in fact taken to such an extreme in Gen 4's Fable Wars that some players mused that knockoff might be broken in that generation too, because your knockoff of Zorber was a Toxic Orb activated Breloom, and that's it. You can't just go, oh, this old Pokemon's item, who needs it? Some Pokemon might be less affected, yes, but affected they certainly are. Knockoff's brokenness has resulted in some truly nuts counterplay. In Gen 6 UU, players were running itemless Crobat so it could switch into knockoff without taking the full brunt of its power, while plenty of Pokemon that would much rather have leftovers wound up going with Colbur Berry instead. And speaking of moves that were changed in Gen 6, our next move on this list is Draco Meteor for Gens 4 and 5. Draco Meteor seems almost quaint nowadays. We've had Fairy fairy types for over a decade, and even its power against neutral targets is no longer so peerless or impressive. Back in Gen 4 and 5 though, it was the most feared attack in the game. Not only were steals its only resist, it was actually stronger. Gen 6 nerfed it to 130 base power, but in its first 2 gens, it clocked in at 140. It was so strong, it didn't even matter that the vast majority of its targets were neutral. It didn't need super effective coverage to wipe most of the metagame off the map in a single hit, and hardly frail targets either. Many common bulky defensive Pokemon being threatened for a one-hit KO by a neutral move was a stunning upgrade in terms of power creep, and was a major distinguishing trait of the post-advanced era, as in Gen 3, it'd be pretty rare to see a neutral bulky target so utterly demolished from full health. Whereas in Gen 4, Draco Meteor made this so ridiculously common, it became the standard. There were other high base power moves introduced in Gen 4 to be sure, but none of them could match Meteor for both power and spammability. It was so strong, even many steel types struggled to switch in. In Gen 4, Scizor famously had to invest in not just max HP, but a sizable chunk of special defense in order to not get 2-hit KO by Choice Specs Latios Draco after Stealth Rock. Yes, even though the second hit would come off of a halved special attack stat. And then the ante was of course upped in Gen 5 with the addition of Latios. Latios rained Draco Meteors down from every angle, spammed as it was into everything. Even Ferrothorn took a healthy chunk from spec sets. The fact that dragons often packed fire coverage or rain boosted surf in Gen 5 or even Magnezone support was really almost incidental. When you have a high base power move coming off of such high special attack stats, well, that's sometimes all you need. Even Dragonite and its base 100 special attack stat was melting pretty much everything in sight with it. Gens 4 and 5 were the Dragon Gens, largely because of Draco Meteor. Locking into Outrage much riskier, powerful though it is, and this was taken to its logical extreme in Ubers. Many a Gen 4 Uber game was a slugfest, where one after another, progressively faster Draco Meteor users would take turns outspeeding each other and claiming their unstoppable KO. Well, unless they missed. You know what didn't have to worry about missing though? The moves that often help get the Draco Meteor user on the field in the first place, which is of course U-turn. Either you use a move or you switch, not both, unless that is you have a switch move. U-turn is being singled out here as it has incredible distribution, number 1, and number 2, lacks immunities, meaning you can't block it like you can Volt Switch with a ground type or Volt Absorb Pokemon, or Flip Turn with a Storm Drain or Water Absorb Pokemon. Heck, even Teleport and Baton Pass can be stifled by Taunt, rare though that is. This is not to diminish the threat and efficacy of any of those moves, as they are often used right alongside U-turn to similarly superb effect, but U-turn is unquestionably the leader and representative of this subgenre of move. When you choose to switch, whatever Pokemon you switch to, your decision is made before the turn. You don't get to see what your opponent is doing. With a switch move though, you have this incredibly powerful advantage. If you U-turn and your opponent switches out, you get to see what they switch in, and adopt your switch in accordingly for the best possible advantage. If you switch because you're expecting the opponent to do the same, you don't have this certainty. You are apt to get caught off guard by the opponent staying in. If you U-turn and the opponent stays in though, you get to change what you switch to because you know what they're going to use, and that's if you're faster anyway. If you got a slower switch move, you have a different advantage, also insanely strong. Since your opponent moves before you, it means the Pokemon you switch to will not risk anything as it comes in. Switch moves are thus the go-to strategy for ensuring hard-hitting yet frail wall breakers are able to consistently hit the field. And since switch moves have such great distribution, it's easy to combine them and have no problem at all getting your chosen threat on the field in spite of its poor defensive profile. It's also a cinch to simply spam switch moves over and over, worrying the opponent down as they repeatedly flee from this next switch move user that came in safely. There were U-turn chains in Gen 4, Volt turn chains in Gen 5, 6, and 7, and then in Gen 8 you had so many switch moves freely flying in conjunction with the hazard ignoring heavy duty boots. The strategy received the name the Vortex. With games going so long, the switch moves eventually began risking running out of PP, which was unheard of previously. Think of switch moves' brokenness like this. If you have Heracross against Celebi, Megahorn might not actually be the correct move in a number of scenarios. However, if you've got Scizor U-turn against Celebi, U-turn tends to automatically be the correct move very often. Who cares about thudding into the bug resist? You actually want that, since it's an opportunity to get your big wall breaker on the field. You get to do so safely without risking a prediction from the Celebi user. It's brutally win-win or lose-lose, depending on which side of the field you're on. And also, you better wish that these aren't on your side of the field, as Stealth Rock and Spikes are our next moves on our list. Stealth Rock has been controversial since its introduction. As soon as players realized that this move wasn't just useful for breaking sashes, the fact that it punished the switches of every single Pokemon in the game, no matter how little, was so extraordinary as to merit mandatory usage on every single team. There was no justification for not using rocks. Nothing nothing you could use in their steed would make your team better for it. There were a few occasions where tournament players thought they were smarter than this, and without fail, they were punished for their lack of rocks every single time. Stealth Rock was pretty much the GSC Snorlax of moves, and yes, this meant many wanted to ban it. It wasn't just that it hit rock weak Pokemon too hard. Yes, you could meme about Charizard, but the fact was that even Stealth Rock neutral Pokemon had the rough tendency to get worn down alarmingly quickly. Stealth Rock made already dangerous offensive Pokemon even more difficult to handle with how severely it enabled one-hit KO and two-hit KO thresholds. However, since rocks quickly became fully entrenched in competitive Pokemon to the point of nearly becoming synonymous, the idea of getting rid of them was seen as too extreme. Not until Gen 8 bringing heavy-duty boots around did Stealth Rock become optional, which in this case, meaning you quote-unquote only wanted it on almost every team instead of literally every single one. Stealth Rock also kept some Pokemon in check, but as much as the player base used to joke about allowing Ho-Oh or Arceus bug and OU, over-relying on rocks to do the job for you just meant if you were able to prevent or remove rocks, you were able to unleash a nearly unstoppable nightmare of Volcarona, multi-scale Dragonite, Regenerator Tornadus Styrian, and what have you. Pokemon who could very well still bowl you over even with rocks, just like Gen 4 Salamence, by the way. Not being able to use rocks to check monsters, of course, came to a head in Gen 8 and 9, which saw Boots, Cinderace, Kyurem, and none other than Volcarona itself pushed to ban-worthy extremes. And it's not just Boots either. Look at how Clefable has been an unbreakable wall to the point of controversy since Gen 4 all the way through Gen 9, simply because Magic Guard lets it naturally ignore rocks. And Spikes, of course. And despite not affecting ground immunes or doing super effective damage, Spikes has been viewed with a blend of controversy and contempt similar to that of Stealth Rock, and it's been doing so before rocks were even around, ever since Gen 3 made Spikes stack up to 3 layers. It's been the same problem in that it limits switching, the lifeblood of competitive singles. Far too much for far too many Pokemon, especially as hazard removal is famously unreliable, and even the boots late in Gen 9 suffers this issue. Funnily enough, irritation with multi-layer Spikes leads many players to try Gen 2, and its single layer, or Gen 1 with no hazards whatsoever. And before we get into our final selection, we've got a number of honorable mentions. First, one-hit KO moves, who are so obviously absurd that they've been banned from singles, even in Ubers, forever. Except once, where the Gen 5 Ubers player base experimented with allowing them. Yeah, that didn't last. Nothing like Kyogre randomly one-hit KO in Arceus Grass with sheer code. One-hit KO moves have also caused some real dumb moments in VGC as well, perhaps most famously with Fissure Ting Lu. In a similar vein, evasion moves like Double Team also turned the game into a pure RNG fest, and as a result, they were banned from singles formats. And speaking of RNG that just kind of counters too much, Sleep moves in Scald have had similarly oppressive reach to Thunder Wave in many generations, with Sleep even being banned outright in Gens 5 and 9, while none can forget the terror of Dark Void Smeargle in Gen 6 VGC. Finally, there are the many busted signature moves that we just couldn't fit in this video. In VGC, Astral Barrage and Glacial Launch are absurdly powerful spread moves, with Ghost and Ice being arguably the best two offensive types in the game, making Calyrex Shadow and Ice absolutely nuts in VGC. Meanwhile, in singles, Thousand Arrows single-handedly made Zygarde absolutely insane in Gen 7 and Gen 8 OU, getting it banned. Turns out, when you can't rely on flyers and levitators against ground spam, it's pretty busted. And now finally, we have our number one with Baton Pass. Baton Pass is now renowned as one of the most obviously broken singles moves ever, but its brokenness wasn't apparent for a long time, so you pass stats to something else, big deal. But even back in the day, it was considered dishonorable to run a full BP team, and not in the way people might hate stall teams or a broken sweeper either. The underlying statement was always there, but back in the day, broken was reserved for things like Mewtwo. But the reasons people thought BP was cheap cheese turned out to be why it was busted, because it reduced the game to an uninteractive matchup fishing element. Even if your team might not be great into stall or a strong sweeper, there's still a game to be played. With Baton Pass, it's pretty much over at the onset. It was thought of as dishonorable because if you thought you could outplay your opponent, there'd be no need to run Baton Pass. There was almost no skill involved in using such a team, as the obvious move was just about always the right one. It didn't matter if you knew what the BP team user was going to do, because either you could stop it or more likely, you couldn't, because answers tended to be incredibly specific. It wasn't much of a game. You just simply watch the win or lose matchup play out. If the other team counters BP, the game is just about instantly over. If it doesn't, well, you better hope that you land a bunch of consecutive critical hits, because if you don't, it's going to be a long, painful process as you helplessly thud into the chain of boosting and passing before getting cleaned up by a super boosted sweeper. It wasn't just full chains either. In Gen 4, you had Gliscor passing Rock Polish and Swords Dance to 4-attack Metagross, which would pretty much sweep on the spot. Gen 5 had Shell Smash passing. Gen 6 and 7 saw Geomancy passing. Turns out, some Pokemon aren't meant to get certain boosts, or at the very least, not have the work in obtaining them done by another. Even something as innocuous as a Speed Pass alone has been found to be broken recently in Gen 3. After people going out of their way to spam BP in Gen 4 and onwards, it stopped being thought of as cheese and was realized to be so broken, it needed to be canned in its entirety, and that's exactly what happened. At best, you can pass substitutes in Gen 5, for example. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Hal, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardine, for their major support of our videos.